teller is no surprise or stranger to us. Fran Stallings has been a part of our storytelling community as a teller and as a presenter and as a leader for as long as I can remember, and I have an elephant's memory. Fran has begun to specialize in telling to help people be more ecologically conscious. She belongs to an organization of stealth eco tellers. Her new CD is Stories and Songs for a Green Earth. Please welcome to our stage Fran Stallings, dual citizenship, Texas and Oklahoma.
Very good. When we first moved to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, our front yard had 2 huge, magnificent mimosa trees. Do you call them mimosa or do you call them silk trees? They have those puffy pink pom-pom flowers that smell so sweet. And they had a great crown of fringy green leaves. And because they were on the west side of the house, that was wonderful because on summer afternoons, they shaded the house. Well, you know, weather on the plains can be variable, and there came a November freeze that caught the trees with their leaves still on. It went from about 55 down to close to 0 in a few hours. And the next morning when the sun came up and the leaves melted, they hung on those mimosa trees like boiled spinach. But the worst of it was what happened under the bark. All the juice under the bark froze and expanded, split the bark off, killed the trees. We waited for next spring. They didn't come back to life. We had to take them out. But what were we going to have in their place? And we decided, well, we loved the mimosas. They were beautiful and fragrant, but they're not native, so no wonder they couldn't deal with the crazy weather that we have. Let's get something sturdy, something native. Oak, red oak, Schumered red oaks. We bought 2 of them. The biggest we could afford. The trunks were about this big in diameter. Put them in. They got settled in the summer, and late in the summer we realized, what were we thinking? Here were these little, barely, not even teenage trees. It was going to be decades before we had any shade. Why hadn't we planted something that grew faster? How long would it take before we had some shade? Well, I was out walking in the neighborhood one time and saw a yard with a Schumered red oak, pretty good-sized trunk. Not a full-grown mature tree, but it was a, young adult type tree. And the man came out of the garage with a lawnmower. I figured he lives here. I said, excuse me, could you tell me, please, how old is your oak tree? How many years have you had it? He looked at me. He looked at the tree, and he said, that's not an oak tree, it's a maple. I said, well, maples have a leaf like this, and your tree, the leaves go like that, oak leaves. He looked at the tree. He looked at me. He said, well, I swan, that explains all them acorns. Sometimes you don't see something unless you believe it, and that's what... Well, those oak trees have thrived. They're good, mature trees now and give us lots of shade and lots of acorns and lots of squirrels. We have been gradually planting the yard in native plants with the hope, well, I'm hoping for zero maintenance is what I'm hoping for, because, you see, they live here. They know how to deal with this weather. You don't have to spray them or feed them or water them. That's good. Natives are good. Trees are good. You know, shade, food and shelter for critters, and their roots hold the soil, and they take CO2 out of the air. Trees are good. Well, you do need to know what you're planting and where and why. And I'm going to tell you a story, a story that I put together out of research, interviews, things. The facts in the story are all true, but full disclosure here to my colleagues, the first-person narrator of this story is fictional, because this is not really my family history. Okay? It's a story about red cedars. Get you a copper kettle, get you a copper coil, fill it with new-made corn mash, and nevermore you will toil. You'll just lay there by the juniper when the moon is bright. Watch them jugs a fillin' in the pale moonlight. I learned that song from my granddad. He learned it from his granddad, said it went way, way back to when the family used to live in the hills back east. They were moonshiners. My daddy, he made whiskey. Granddaddy, he did too. We ain't paid no whiskey tax since 1792. We just lay there by the juniper when the moon is bright. Watch them jugs a fillin' in the pale moonlight. Well, I asked about, really, moonshiners? He said, well, now you got to understand, when great-great-great-granddaddy first settled in those hills, having fought in the Revolutionary War, and General Washington didn't have the money to pay his soldiers, so he gave them land grants. In those oak hickory hills, a man could work hard, clear some land, plant corn, and then when he got a crop in, everybody else been planting corn. You couldn't sell it for worth the trouble. Couldn't ship it, too heavy and bulky, but if you could distill it down into what they now call in the farmer's market, they call it a value-added product. Then you had something lightweight and worth a lot of money, but the government sort of wanted a piece of that. And that's when they started sending out the revenuers. 1792 was what they called the Whiskey War. But the folks in the hills, they learned that they would have to hide their still houses, and there's nothing better than that, than the junipers. Well, now, I'll tell you, Juniperus virginiana, that's the scientific name of the tree, but out here on the plains anyway, we call them red cedars. Eastern red cedar. See, they were evergreen, so when the rest of the oak hickory forest had dropped its leaves, you could still hide your still house under the red cedars. And those low, full branches would hide it. Just lay there by the junipers and watch the jugs of fillin'. That's not all that those trees were good for. They're called red because the heartwood of the tree, it's almost purple. It's beautiful. Besides, it won't rot. You make the best fence posts out of that. Cedar shake shingles, they'll last for decades. Furthermore, the oil in those needles, if you could extract that, they made all kinds of medicine out of it. And the wood, insects didn't like it either. Matter of fact, now this is true, I still have my grandma's blanket chest. And it still keeps wool blankets and sweaters safe from moth. So they valued those red cedar trees when they saw them, and when the folks came out of the hills and they settled in Oklahoma back in the run of 1889, they came out there And there's not much in the way of trees of any kind. It was prairie grass that had been maintained for millennia by the native nations that came out, and if lightning didn't start a grass fire, they did, because the fire's growing quick over the surface, leaving the grass growing with its underground roots. That fire would kill off the seedlings that might have grown up into woods instead. They maintained the prairie, that beautiful prairie where the herds of bison used to travel. But when the settlers came out there, they plowed it up. They put in crops. Back to about the time of World War I, the price of wheat skyrocketed and they plowed up more prairie. And then in the roaring 20s, they plowed up more. They didn't find any cedar trees. They looked around and the only ones you could find were the ones that grow in a rocky, gravelly place where the grass can't take the fires to them. But of course, settlers didn't want their farms burning, and so they suppressed the fire. 1930s came along, and you've heard about that time. North wind took Oklahoma and Kansas and blew it into Texas, and then the south wind took Texas and blew it up into Oklahoma and Kansas. Sometimes a west wind took that dust and blew it all the way east to Washington, D.C., which is when they decided to do something. And the Department of Agriculture said, what you people need is windbreaks. And so they set out to planting east-west bands of trees. Tall trees in the middle, cottonwood, elm, so forth. But on both sides, they encouraged people to plant red cedars, being evergreen, and with their branches clear to the ground, they would stop the wind year-round. My mother grew up on one of those farms. She remembers that windbreak. She said it was the best place to play. Even in the summer, it was shady and cool. Those red cedars would send their roots down deep in the ground, bring up the water, and evaporate it. It was cool in there. Besides, she didn't have to worry about poison ivy, greenbrier, sticker vines, because, she thought it was because of the shade, but I've studied on this, and it's called allelopathy. This is something in the needles that prevents other things from growing. So it was nice in there in the windbreak. Well, you've probably seen red cedar trees. You know, some of them are, this time of year, they're kind of a yellowish color. Those are the males. Do not inhale. They are giving off their pollen. Some people get cedar fever from that pollen. The females are still decked out with last year's fruit. Those little kind of gray-green berries, fleshy cones. Birds love them. So in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, the birds would land in the female trees and gobble up those berries. Then they go light on a fence row or a power line. And red cedars were sprouting up everywhere. Well, red cedars are good, right? You can do all kinds of good things with them. But as more and more red cedars began to grow, with fires being suppressed, pretty soon you began to notice that what had been a good pasture was now just red cedar. Not only were they suppressing other things from growing, but they were pumping the water out of the ground and evaporating it, and your creeks were drying up, and your springs were drying up, and if you had a stock pond ringed around with red cedar, pretty soon you had a mud puddle. They were good trees, but oh my, what's going on here? Besides, those oily needles, they are so flammable. Have you ever seen one on fire? Grass fire comes up to it, starts to climb those branches, and boom, whole thing goes off like a Roman candle, and the sparks fly in the wind, and there goes your subdivision. Well, what are you going to do? Red cedars were good, were they? But now here they are coming into the prairies, coming into the pastures. You talk with ranchers in Oklahoma, and I bet down here too. Red cedar is one word as far as they're concerned, and it also goes along with some adjectives that I had not heard before. We got a problem. They're native, so you're not allowed to say they're invasive. Invasive is only used for foreigners like kudzu or those white pear trees. Yeah. With natives, you're allowed to say that they are aggressive. Red cedar's pretty aggressive. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Fire, that's how they used to control it, but fire is suppressed. You can't have a fire come into your subdivision. We were pretty impressed when the Oklahoma Department of Forestry came in south of Bartlesville and they cleared the red cedars out of a wood patch. I don't know what they did with them, but at least they cleared it, because if fire, we've had these range fires. If fire had come near town, it would have taken out that subdivision. What are we going to do about it? Well, some people have gotten pretty creative. Have you seen rustic style furniture built out of red cedar? It makes beautiful furniture, in addition to smelling really nice. I mean, I like the smell of red cedar even if insects don't. Make the furniture. Have you seen bunk beds with rustic poles, sometimes with the little branch stubs left on for you to hang your pajamas on? I thought that was pretty cool. They make wonderful posts for your country house. And meanwhile, the shavings of the wood, insects don't like that smell. How about stuffing your dog bed with it? You can buy red cedar shavings at Walmart in the pet department for your hamster, but your Great Dane's going to need a lot more. And this is where the Cedarside Company comes in, down Louisville, Texas. Cedarside. They are selling all kinds of products made out of red cedar. Now, I haven't heard where they get their trees from, but I know that there are places where they'll clear the red cedar off your land, cart them away, and do something with them. They sell red cedar bedding. They sell red cedar to prevent insects from getting into your house. And my favorite thing is the Cedarside spray. That's an emulsion of red cedar oil. I spray it on when I want to work out in the garden and not need a blood transfusion afterward because of the mosquitoes. So there are things that red cedar trees are good, or are they bad? They're doing what plants do. It's when people get involved that we start to have a little trouble plowing up the prairie, suppressing the fire, spreading the red cedar trees. Go ask King Midas. He knew gold was good, so more must be better, but sometimes a little too much is not so good. So when you're driving, we were watching, when you're driving, keep a lookout for those red cedar trees. They're just doing what plants do. Thank you.